are we experiencing the final stages of the war in Ukraine?
Yes, I would add simply that this was an unnecessary, completely feckless effort from the outset. I spent several years as an Army infantry intelligence officer. Okay. I learned the rudimentary skills and I practiced them. This may sound corny, but before we did anything, before we even sent a platoon or a squad out to do a mission, we did an estimate of the situation. Okay. Now, we had to memorize that. I still have it in my craw here. Let me see if I can remember it. You look at the enemy and you see how many there are. You see how well they're trained or how well they're equipped. And then you look at the weather, what kind of weather should you expect? Then you look at the terrain and what kind of terrain. And then you look at what we used to call locks. Now, it's not the locks that you eat with a bagel in New York City. This is LOCS, lines of communication and control and supply, really, okay, or intelligence. So when you look at all those things and you look at a map, and you have a rudimentary knowledge of where the correlation of forces is, you say, whoa, Russia has to have the upper hand here. Look at the map and look at the population difference between Russia and Ukraine. Look how fearful Russia is if NATO made Ukraine part of NATO. Look how much a core interest that the Russians consider this to be. Now, can Ukraine beat Russia? You would have to be an idiot to say, oh, sure they can. So what gave the Ukrainians the idea that they could defeat Russia? It was the United States and these neocons that advised Biden. They sort of they sort of did away with what Obama sensibly said. And what Obama said was, look, core interests are really important, okay? So we have to be very careful of how much we commit to interests that are not core interests. Now, Russia has a core interest in Ukraine. We don't. What does that mean? That means we should we should be very careful not to give the Ukrainians the idea that they can beat Russia, that they can defeat Russia militarily. Hello, Obama didn't even go to infantry officers orientation course, but he looked at the map and he knew enough about that and enough about Russian concerns about NATO. So that's what he said. Why Biden and his sycophant advisors turned their back on that, said, oh, no, we can win. And in the process, the best thing, we can weaken Russia. We can weaken it to the point that Putin will collapse and we'll be able to carve up Russia so it's never a threat to us in the future. We'll put economic sanctions and we'll make them an economic basket, okay? So these people are what we used to call the crazies. Now that goes back to George H.W. Bush, under whom I served and whom I briefed every other morning one-on-one, okay? We used to refer to these people as the crazies, quote, unquote. And he meant these neocons who thought they could rule the world, that the same people, by the way, had great difficulty distinguishing between the strategic interests of the United States and the strategic interests of Israel that played a great role in our attack on Iraq under his son, okay? So we have these crazies and we're wondering, so they went back on what Obama said and they thought that they could win. Now, they were also putting out the propaganda that Putin is he wants to recreate the Russian Empire, right? Okay, and even President Biden said a month ago they won't stop at Ukraine. They'll go further. If they attack a NATO member, American boys will be fighting Russian boys. Oh, Biden's saying that, okay? Now, is there any evidence that Putin wants to take over Poland or one of the Baltics? I've been in both, okay? I don't know why you would want to do that. He's got no trouble in his own country, okay? So this whole misconception that Putin went into Ukraine to take over Ukraine and then widen, go to Portugal, for God's sake, it's crazy. But these guys are the crazies. So what happened? Well, Putin decided that he had no option. And this is really important, okay? Don't take it from McGovern. He has much less stature than John Mearsheimer, professor of international relations at the University of Chicago, and a friend of mine now, who says, and I asked him this question at an open forum, John, in your view, did Putin have any other viable option other than to invade Ukraine? Now, John is the dean of the realist school of international relations, okay? And thank goodness he doesn't mince words. And he said, Ray, no. I think, and I believe, and I see evidence that Putin did everything he conceivably could to prevent himself from having to intervene, from having to do a special military operation inside Ukraine. I see that evidence loud and clear, and that's my answer. He had no other option. Now, I was glad to hear that because I had come to the same conclusion even before that. And there are lots of reasons why that conclusion should be known, but can't be known because of this aversion to be seen as in Putin's pocket. How many times have I been called in Putin's pocket? Now, there's one other set of circumstances here that most people don't know. And that is that there's a direct analogy between what happened in Iran, what happened in Ukraine, and what happened in Cuba in 1962. I remember that. I had just come on active duty as an infantry intelligence officer at Fort Benning, Georgia, where, although it was the infantry training center, there were no weapons. We were bright-eyed and, we want to train on this new grenade launcher. My God, we heard of this grenade launcher. Where are they? They are. We finally got a sergeant to say, look, 2 divisions came through here 5 weeks ago. They took all our weapons. They're down in Key West, Florida, ready to go into Cuba. And they haven't come back yet. So I had a personal experience of how close we were to invading Cuba and probably no longer existing if the Russians retaliated with their nuclear weapons, okay? So what am I saying? I'm saying that in 1962, Khrushchev was let himself be persuaded by his military, hey, good for you, good idea. Let's put offensive missiles in Cuba. Castro wants us to do that. It would be great because then the time launched to target, we could hit Washington in about 8 or 9 minutes. It could destroy all those naval ports, those naval bases on the East Coast. And if we got intermediate range ballistic, maybe we could take out Omaha and, we would take out pretty much the whole. So let's do it. And Khrushchev said, well, He had met with Kennedy in Vienna earlier that year, and he got the impression that Kennedy was sort of a pushover. So he said, "All right, nothing ventured, nothing gained," and they did it. Now, it's hard for me to realize that a lot of people don't realize this, but they did it. Okay, they took ships, loaded them with medium-range ballistic missiles, and got them and placed in Cuba with nuclear warheads before the CIA became aware of it. Okay, now you can blame it on a lot of things. There was a misconception that the Russians would never try that. That was sort of, bad. But it was also the fact that there was cloud cover over Cuba. We didn't have too many U-2s at the time. Finally, in the middle of September, oops, there they are. Wow. Kennedy asked us, are they armed? Us. I hadn't actually joined the agency. It was a year before. Now, my boss, Ray Klein, who is the head of intelligence, told Kennedy, look, these things don't make any sense at all unless they're armed with nuclear warheads. We know there are nuclear warheads in Cuba. It would be a fool's errand to say, well, maybe they're not armed. We have to assume that some of them are armed, okay? So with that in mind, Kennedy still played this very, very adroit game with Khrushchev, okay? And he persuaded Khrushchev that America's core interests were violated by what Khrushchev done. And Khrushchev couldn't argue that Russian core interests were at stake. For Russia, it was nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so Khrushchev finally, because he was in contact with Kennedy, it was teletype in those days, but it was almost immediate, okay? There's nothing like that today, to my knowledge. He said, all right, he looked at his generals and his admirals and said, well, all right, pull him out of there. And he saw that he was going to have trouble. And so he went to Bobby Kennedy through Ambassador Dobrynin and said, look, we need something. I need something to tell my generals and admirals that this was just a cave-in on my part. And so they worked out a deal where similar missiles from the United States and placed in Turkey would be taken out in several months quietly, and that it would not be announced as part of the deal. The deal was no invasion of Cuba, and in reaction to that, the Russians pulled out their missiles. Now, one little side issue here: was Cuba within its rights to say we want offensive strike missiles in Cuba? Well, we learned 2 years ago that every country has a sovereign right to be allied with anyone, and by extension to have any kind of weaponry that ally will provide. And the reason I mention that, of course, in the Ukraine context, because that's where it was put into play, is that nobody in 1962, nobody said, wait a second, Fidel Castro, there's a sovereign Cuba here. He has every right to have intermediate range missiles. Nobody said that, because everyone kind of realized that this had to do with core interests, okay? Core interests, in this case, by the United States. In the case of Ukraine, core interests for Russia. Just to finish this analogy, okay? There are missile bases already installed by the United States in Poland and in Romania. They have been there for a couple of years now. They have caps on them, so the Russians can't tell what kind of missiles are in there, okay? They could be ABM, anti-ballistic missiles. They could be anti-ship missiles. They could be cruise missiles, or eventually they could be hypersonic missiles already in place. I mean, these canisters, or whatever you want to call them, are in place in Romania and Poland. So Time from launch to target? Well, for a run-of-the-mill ballistic missile, about 8 minutes. Okay. Now for a hypersonic missile, 10, 5 minutes. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because we know what hypersonic missiles can do. The Russians have them, the US doesn't have them. But we also know that because on the 21st of December, so 2 months before the invasion of Ukraine, Putin said, "Look," he talked to his top militaries. They all had 4 stars. These were the real guys, the admirals and the generals. He said, "Look, the United States could put offensive strike missiles in Eastern Europe. They could even put them in Ukraine." That's interesting. They're already in Romania and Poland. The canisters are, we don't know what's in them. By the way, in Cuba, we knew exactly what kind of missiles they were because they were out in the open. They weren't in canisters, okay? So there's this unknown aspect to this. So here's Putin saying the 21st of December, 2021, look, if these people get hypersonic missiles like the US will eventually have in Romania and Poland, and eventually in Ukraine, I have 5 minutes to decide whether to blow up the rest of the world. So, says Putin, we need ironclad agreements. We need pieces of paper that show treaties and stuff, Now, maybe it was my imagination, but I looked around at those generals and admirals, and I thought, they're probably thinking, wait a second, wasn't the anti-ballistic missile treaty written down? Wasn't the intermediate nuclear forces treaty written down? How about the open skies treaty? Wasn't that written down? Come on, Vladimir. You're going to settle for something written down now? In any event, that was the 21st of December, okay? Now, on the 30th, so what is that? 9 days later, the White House gets a call from the Kremlin. President Putin would like to talk to President Biden, like right away. The White House was flummoxed. Wait a second, they said, our negotiators are going to be meeting in Geneva on the 9th and 10th of January. That's less than 2 weeks away. What? Look, please, Mr. Putin, I'd really like to talk to President Biden. So, to his credit, Biden said, okay. He took the call. And what did Putin do? He raised this issue of what he had said on the 21st, the possibility that the US would put offensive strike missiles, such as maybe in Romania and Poland, in Ukraine, okay? The readout from that session on the 30th of December was Mr. Biden said that the US had no intention of putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. Whoa! So, as I put it together, these admirals and generals said, look, you need more than rhetoric. You need more than a piece of paper. Get a personal commitment from the President of the United States not to do that. And he did. U.S. never disputed that, okay? So, what happens? Well, things look pretty good. New Year's Eve was never so joyous in Russia. Yuri Ushakov, who's Putin's right-hand man on these issues, was waxing eloquent. He said, oh my God, we have this treaty that we surfaced. They were unwilling to sign it, but a commitment not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, that meets fully the majority of I think they had 7 things in the treaty. It meets 5 of those requirements. So they're off to a good start in Geneva. And what happens? They go to Geneva, and the Russian negotiators say, okay, now let's get down to brass tacks. Let's work out sort of an explicit arrangement, what's going to happen with respect to your president's promise not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. And Wendy Sherman, the head of the U.S. delegation, says, huh? We don't know anything about that. Oh, wait a second. This was in the readout from their conversation on the 30th of December. What do you mean you don't know? Well, we don't have any instructions on that. Suffice it to say that on February 12th, so February 12th, was that about 6 weeks after Biden undertook not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, Biden and Putin talked again on the phone, and the readout from that was Ushakov again saying, Mr. Biden refused to discuss his earlier undertaking not to put offensive missiles in Ukraine, and he would not address the notion of Ukraine not becoming a member of NATO. Whoa. Again, that was the 12th of February, 2022 now, okay? So if you subtract 24 or 12, you got about 12 days before Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Now, am I saying that this was the only reason he did that? No, not at all. But it was one of the major reasons where Putin said, I can't trust these guys. I mean, the president of the United States tells me 1-1 on the phone that they're not going to do this, and now they don't have any instructions. That came on top of all these other things where Putin realized that he had been led down the primrose path with respect to the Minsk agreements very quickly. At Minsk in 2015, they decided to, that is, Germany and France took on the job of working with Donetsk and Lugansk, the Ukrainian capital, and working out an agreement for a ceasefire and for giving Lugansk and Donetsk a degree of autonomy, sort of like a federation, a state. Give them an degree of so they could use their own language, Russian and so forth. Now, what happened? Well, Putin let himself be diddled for how many years? Well, 15, 20, 22, that's 7 years, okay? And they never really intended to do that. And so Putin said, well, this is really for the birds. And then what happened? The Ukrainians massed their forces against Donetsk and Lugansk. They upped their artillery shelling of these civilian areas from 500 a day to 1,400 a day. That was in middle February 2022. And Putin said, all right, well, that's it. I think we can't trust these guys anymore. We have our own core interests to defend here. We're going to go in and clean them out. Now, when he went in with about 90,000 troops, okay? And this is the most important thing now, given the most recent revelations. He went in with enough troops to scare the bejesus out of Zelensky, okay? On the second day, he said, we're ready to talk about all this. We don't have to, And yeah, did he surround Kiev? Yeah, he surrounded Kiev, right? But then they stopped. And then they said, well, okay, let's negotiate. And the Ukrainians sent some people up to Belarus, and the Russians did too. They started talking in February, right after the invasion. And then in March, the discussions, the negotiations moved to Istanbul in Turkey, okay? And they came to an agreement on the 29th of March, 2022, when the war had just pretty much begun. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because two of the Ukrainian negotiators have now admitted in public that Putin was able to settle this thing in 6 weeks as long as we agreed to remain neutral, there would be a ceasefire, and there would be certain restrictions on how much weaponry we could have in Ukraine and so forth. But it was all but it was initial, but all but signed. So what happened? Well, Zelensky went to the U.S., his masters really by then, and he also went to his neo-fascist Nazis. And he said, so that's a pretty good deal, huh? And the Nazis didn't have a hell of a lot to do with this, but the U.S. did. And the neocons, the crazies, said to Zelensky, nothing doing. This is crazy. Don't deal with the Russians. No, don't deal with the Russians. I'll tell you what, we will support you for as long as it takes. We got all these fancy arms. The Russians are weak. They can't contend with us. We got all this stuff. So just tell them no, okay? And that's what Zelensky did. Now, Boris Johnson, who was head of England at the time, played a role in that, a messenger role. Look, no deal. You tell them no deal, and we'll protect you for as long. Now they say as long as we can. But for many, many months, it was for as long as it takes. Okay, Biden and everybody else. Okay. So Zelensky was not smart enough to realize, look, from a military point of view, we don't have a chance. We don't have a chance against the Russians. But he was, he's getting a lot of money and everything from a lot of corruption going on there. He's getting these arms, and maybe I'll become a big political figure in the world. And so he bought it to his, what's happening now, of course, the whole collapse of the whole thing. So that's how it went down. And when you talk about these people who have just come out, negotiators, the people that went to Belarus and then the people who went to Istanbul, they confirm what Gerhard Schröder, former Chancellor of Germany, a former Prime Minister of Israel, and one or two others at Erdogan of Turkey have said it was the deal. That was the deal. It was all set. Okay. Now, simultaneously, what happened to those troops around Kiev? They were withdrawn. Was that part of the deal? Seems to be. Now, why didn't people see the light? Why did people say, well, okay, this is sensible? Before 500,000 young Ukrainians get killed in a war that they can't win, let's settle for this. After all, if it's neutral, some autonomy for these guys, let's do this deal. Well, they couldn't do that, or they didn't do that. And what happened, of course, was Putin became convinced that he can't deal with the West because it's thoroughly dishonest. I'll just add this. The invasion was on the 24th of February, 2022. That December, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, whom I mentioned, Germany and France were the guarantors of Minsk, okay? She got up and she said, this was the Minsk agreements. We really tricked the Russians because this was just a stratagem to buy more time so that we could build up the Ukrainian army to NATO standards with NATO weaponry, and that was it. It was a time share. And look at the Ukrainian forces now. In 2014, they couldn't win anything. Now look how they're Angela Merkel gloating over the fact that she had pulled the wool over Putin's eyes. A month later, François Hollande, the president of France at the time, said exactly the same thing. Okay. So, Putin has said publicly now, I was naive. Now, my guess is that only a pretty strong president can admit to naivete. But the facts are on the ground. He said, I was told not to trust the Americans. I trusted them. And look what happened in those 7 years. Not only did NATO build up Ukrainian forces, but 14,000 Russian-speaking folks in Donetsk and Lugansk were killed, civilians in Donetsk city, for God's sake. No military, they were killed. And there was an uptick, as I said before, at the end of February from 500 a day to 1,400. That's big, okay? So now, lastly, I'll just say this. When John Mearsheimer says that Russia had no other option, that they had tried everything else, well, not only the Minsk stuff, but the business that they were already agreed on the 1st of April, let's say, and then there was an April Fool. This was for the real deal, okay? They could have stopped the thing then, except the U.S. told them, no, don't do that. So now, what happened just then? Bucha. Remember? Bucha? Remember what we talked about? Rape? Well, torturing and dismembering bodies and leave them all over the street. Oh, that could be almost as effective as rape. And so that's what happened. Where did it happen? In this place in Bucha, Ukraine. On whom was it blamed? The Russians, of course. Who did it? Well, there's been no investigation, but the Russians had already left the city. It's very clear to me that the Ukrainian Special Services did that. That was a hue and cry. It dominated the news, and it allowed the US and the UK and all these other guys to say, oh, look how bad the Russians are. We can't do any deals with them. And so we have to build up Ukraine to give Russia a defeat. Our defense minister, our Secretary Austin, said that. One of our goals, this is a quote, one of our goals is to move heaven and earth to make sure that we help Ukraine defeat Russia. Now, why didn't he listen to Obama to say that's not possible? Last thing I'll say on this is, why is this consequential today? Why is it so consequential when we have Russia not having lost, as Biden said 5 months ago, but Ukraine having lost and all its supporters, especially the US, out of ammunition, out of money? It's going to be a really bad deal. Well, I'll just say this very briefly. Biden, Lincoln, Sullivan, certainly Hunter Biden have personal stakes in what happens in the election shortly. If Ukraine is seen to have won, to have lost this war, and the Russians won, this will be very bad because Biden will ipso facto lose the election. Okay. Now, if he loses the election, the 4 guys I just mentioned are liable to go to jail. 2 of them already with evidence in court and in other documents, and the other 2 clearly, guilty of constructing Russiagate for one thing, and for drumming up those 51 intelligence officers who said that Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian disinformation operation. Okay, that's got to be against the law too. So there's a personal stake in all this, and that's what really worries me, because lastly, this is the first time in my experience, and I've been alive since World War II, that a nuclear-armed nation has challenged another nuclear-armed nation to a victory or defeat, okay? Now, John Kennedy, who is responsible for getting me down to Washington from the Bronx, he said in that wonderful speech at American University on June the 10th, 1963, the couple of months after I had joined the CIA, he said, the most important thing to remember is that we have to avoid, if there are 2 nuclear powers, and there were only 2 at the time, Neither should give the other a choice between a humiliating defeat or having to use nuclear weapons. Okay. Hello, makes eminent good sense, right? Now, the Russians are not going to suffer any humiliating retreat or defeat in Ukraine. Washington is. The people running Washington are crazy, by definition. Putin himself has called them crazy, okay? Literally. Now, given all I've mentioned, and given the personal stake that these people have in not losing the war and the election and losing their freedom in prison, what are they likely to do? Well, my great fear is that they'll resort to these mini nukes. They're just about 1/10 of the power of the bomb we dropped on Hiroshima. Yeah, we'll show the Russians a lesson, and then they'll cease and desist at least until we win the election. Okay, crazy? Yeah, that's crazy. Do I think it likely? I don't know, but the fact that I'm raising the issue has the hair standing up on the back of my head. I mean, I've been around for a while. I want my grandchildren to live, and everybody else to live as well. And so, yeah, that's where we are right now in Ukraine.
When you look at China cutting a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Russia trying to solve the problems between Armenia and Azerbaijan, what's the official foreign policy of the US, of the Biden administration, in your opinion? Why they're not looking for some sort of negotiations in Ukraine, in Gaza? Has US lost its role as a superpower?
The reasons are complicated, but I'll reduce them to their basic minimum. You'll recall the tragedies written by Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Those Greek heroes in those plays their downfall was called by what the Greeks call hubris, Greek word for arrogance or overweening power, okay? Overweening arrogance. That was the tragic flaw. And I dare say that's the tragic flaw with respect to people like President Joe Biden. I would adduce lots of examples, but I'll stick to one, okay? About 3 weeks ago, he was asked on 60 Minutes, Mr. President, do you think that, could you handle a two-front war like in Ukraine and in China or Far East, or maybe a three-front war now with Israel? And what was Biden's reaction? He sat back and he said, don't you know? We're talking about the United States of America, the most powerful country in the history of the world. Did you hear me? In the history of the world. End quote. Now, that was true. When I was 6 years old and World War II was over, it was true when the Soviet Union imploded. Nobody has told Joe Biden it ain't true anymore. And, more and more, I'm afraid that he is calling the shots. Earlier, I had thought that he's just a tool in the hands of these crazy neocons, Sullivan and Blinken. But, some weird things, even weirder than the policies we've seen heretofore. We have seized, or they have frozen, 300 billion with a B Russian assets, right? Now, Biden is having his minions think about, let's use those. Let's seize those. Yeah, that's a way. Then we could finance the Ukraine war. Maybe 300 billion more will do it. Maybe we'll face down the Russians, and maybe we won't lose the election. Yeah, let's do it. Now, that is the definition of crazy. You want to shoot yourself in the foot financially? You want BRICS and all these other people to say, look, the dollar isn't worth a damn anymore. This would be a catastrophe. But the fact that our administration is pushing this idea and that they might actually do it, despite, I think, more sober heads telling him this is really crazy. Well, we do crazy things in this administration. And we do especially crazy things when we're afraid of losing the election and losing our freedom. So this persuades me that this arrogance, this hubris, this feeling that we are truly exceptional, that God gave us, sort of like the Israelis, a special reason to guide the rest of the world. Okay, that's for the birds, to put that in Bronx vernacular. And the fact is that Biden hasn't glommed onto this, and I don't know if his acolytes like Blinken and Sullivan have the guts to say, "Oh, Mr. President, yeah, we were wrong on Ukraine. You know, it's a Russian core interest, not ours." Like Obama said. Remember when Obama said that we shouldn't give the Ukrainians the idea they could be Russian? Well, yeah, we should have listened to it. Do they have the courage to do that? Do they have the courage even to say this would be crazy to seize Russian financial assets worth 300 billion? I don't think so. So what do we have here? We have a situation where the crazies are in charge. Luckily, and I say that advisedly, we have some perspicacious people, some people who have a better handle on reality in the Kremlin and in Beijing. I talk about not only Putin, but Xi Jinping. Now, is he going to invade Taiwan? No, for God's sake. The Chinese have the long view on things. They're willing to wait until the time is right. There's no indication they're going to invade Taiwan. So what is all this business? It has to do with something that I guess we haven't mentioned yet, and that is the Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, earlier called the MIC, the military industrial complex, by President Eisenhower. As he was leaving office, he said, look, this is the real threat to American democracy because they are gaining power, and the only way to prevent it is by a well-informed American citizenry. And that's precisely what we lack today. So just to finish up on China, Xi has made it very clear, look, we don't want to get in a war with you guys, but we don't like to be talked down to. We're used to that. We've been around for not only centuries, but millennia, okay? We know how the British tried to treat us last century. We're not going to accept that anymore. Okay, so you Blinken and Sullivan, go read some more recent history books and see that the history has changed. Now, after rejecting this U.S. Dominant theory, the Chinese always say, "Look, let's have a win-win situation. Can't we just get along?" I mean, you have your president's spokesperson, John Kirby, saying, we're not going to let the Chinese come into the Caribbean, into our ocean, into our seas. Well, we don't really intend to do that. But why are you coming into our ocean? I mean, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Why are you sailing right next to China? Why are you sending aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits? Why are you flying bombers close to our coast? Yeah, do we buzz them? Yeah, we buzz them. Suppose there's an accident? There could be, Mr. Biden. What are you going to do about it? So what I'm saying here is the Mickey Mat, the people that profiteer on building ships. There have been lots of people saying, we have to match the Chinese Navy. We're not supreme anymore. They build these great ships. We got to do the same. They're making piles of dough out of this. That's part of it. The other is this hubris, this imperial thing. We have to put the Chinese in their place, just like the British did in the 19th century, or we could do that because we're exceptional, because we're indispensable, and because, just because we're the United States of America, powerful country in the world, most powerful in the world. Did you hear me? In the world. I think he really believes that. I'm just glad that those he's challenging are not going to seize the bait. They're going to proceed cautiously in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. And Putin is going to attrition away what's left of the Ukrainian troops and try not to give Biden any excuse for some major retaliation, which these crazies could well advise him to do. Nukes, mini nukes, my God. The mention of them, as I say, makes me really upset because I have never considered that as likely in the past as I do now.
Right, to just wrap up this session, I want to talk about Taiwan. In your opinion, if something happens in Taiwan, what would be the Russia's reaction? Are Russians going to support China, sending some military advisors, helping them?
Neiman, that's a very good question. Over the last 3, 4, 5 years, the relationship between China and Russia has become a virtual military alliance, okay? Now, they don't say military alliance because they have a principal position that you don't bind anybody else to do anything else, okay? But it's the same, okay? Now, I've been saying for 3 or 4 years that if there's a dust up in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits, for example, you can expect at least some saber rattling in Ukraine or in Syria or in the Atlantic Ocean, okay? I think that's probably the case. Will the Russians have to do more than threaten or saber rattle? I think so. The Chinese are quite capable of taking care of themselves out there. I mean, they have armies and navies that they've never had before. The U.S. has supply. Well, again, look at the map. Why would you think that you should engage in a military conflict with China as far away as it is? So yeah, I think the Russians and the Chinese are now joined at the hip. I think the Russians will support China in defending its core interests in Taiwan, just as they fully expect the Chinese, and that the Chinese have surprisingly done, supporting Russia's strategic interests, its core interests in Ukraine. And that, my friend, was a change. That was a change in China's declared policy, Westphalia, no violation of international borders, no interference in the countries, blah, 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 blah. Okay. They made an exception for Putin to invade Ukraine, and they've stood behind him. And all this talk about exploiting some sort of differences between Russia and China. Well, they could have done that way back several decades ago, and they did. It ain't possible anymore. So you have one against two, one superpower against two. The problem is there's very little indication that our policymakers, and particularly the President of the United States, realize that and are likely to act on their own impulses, as the president says, we're the United States of America, most powerful country in the world. In the world. Did you hear me? In the world.